Hello and welcome to Deep Dive Movie Reviews with my friend Steve Hackman and myself, James Marsh. This episode, we are going to be talking about Joel Coen's The Tragedy of Macbeth.
Hey, before we begin, though, I want to say straight away, we just hit 100 subscribers. We are so grateful to our first 100 subscribers for joining us along the movie journey. And if you haven't subscribed already, please go ahead and hit that button. And that way you never, ever miss a video. James, what are we looking at today?
Okay, so The Tragedy of Macbeth is the latest adaptation of the William Shakespeare classic, more than 400 years old. This sees Joel Coen directing on his own for the very first time, separated from his brother and usual collaborator Ethan Coen, and stars Denzel Washington and Frances McDormand as the Scottish king and queen, who are told by a mysterious trio of witches that he will become king, and so that leads him on a bloody path of ambition, betrayal, and ultimately tragedy.
James, I want to say straight away, a lot of times we like to give our baggage, like what we bring to the table, and obviously with William Shakespeare and with Macbeth, this is not a new work. This is something we're very familiar with. I did amateur theater while I was in grad school about 20 years ago. And the first show I did for the Upstart Crow Theater Company, which is a classical theater company, which always tends to do Shakespeare as well as other classical works. And I remember the day that I saw the audition for Macbeth, and my wife encouraged me to do it. And I got a role. I got the role of Seward. And so I have a fond affection for this particular play. I just want to say straight away, I love what Joel Coen has done with this. We haven't even got to the cast. We haven't got to Denzel. We haven't got to Frances. We'll get there because it's all brilliant. But just how Joel Coen has imagined Macbeth, because whenever you tackle Shakespeare, you're tackling well-trod territory that has been done by other greats before you. So there's always a reimagining or how can we do this a little different? I'm not always a big fan of when the reimagination takes on a whole different template, like a future setting or a modern setting. I'm not as big a fan with that. I prefer things to be kept in their original setting, but to see the interpretation within that setting. What Joel Coen does is, first of all, the cinematography and the staging of this movie is brilliant. It's in black and white. And rather than it being in an outdoor setting in Scotland, it is done all on sound stages. And for me, Shakespeare's plays are meant to be done on the stage. They work on the stage. They don't always transfer as well to the natural settings of everyday life. Having said that, I love Kenneth Branagh's Much Ado About Nothing. I love Hamlet, which obviously were not done on stage sets. They were done outside.
On location.
On location.
Sure.
That was the term I was looking for. On location. Outside, on location. And so you get kind of the feel of being in this intimate setting of watching almost like you're at a Shakespeare festival. And it's done so well and so brilliantly, and the imagery is with the witches and how they transform into birds, and just the angles that the camera work is shot at. It takes the natural language of Shakespeare and adds a visual dynamic, which I thought was stunning to watch.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. I mean, like you said, we've seen so many different adaptations of Macbeth and of Shakespeare over the years. And so often, I think you feel justified. You feel that you need to justify why you are adapting it again, why you are bringing it to the stage again. And so there's always this temptation to reimagine it in some bold new way. I mean, you look like Forbidden Planet, which is the Tempest in space, and you're like, okay, fine, and it works to a degree. I mean, West Side Story, we were talking about not too long ago, is Romeo and Juliet as a musical, and as we were talking about with West Side Story as well, I think we were saying, if I remember rightly, that one of the things that didn't work as well as it could have done with us is that disconnect between watching a musical as a film, and you really want to appreciate the performance. And when they break into song, that seems to work better when you are there in the room with them, because it's more like a musical performance. And I feel that what Joel Coen has done here is he's the opposite of strayed away or tried to get away from the theatricality of the play and of Shakespeare. He's really embraced it completely. Like you were saying, he's got these minimalist sets. There's almost no detail, and I think there's a number of reasons for that I want to get into a little bit later. But it's artificial and it looks artificial, and that's kind of the point.
Well, James, even the footsteps that are made, you don't feel like it's foot on stone. It is foot on soundstage floor. That's what you're hearing is sound. This is what I would hear if I'm in the theater, and I totally agree with what you're saying. This is what Joel Coen is going for. He's going for a filmed theater experience. And I think a lot of that from a sort of an aesthetic point of view, from a sort of thematic point of view, is that he's trying to say something about the character's journey and how his ambition is a Pyrrhic one. The idea of becoming king is ultimately depends on the man assuming the role. There's almost no sort of pomp and ceremony and regalia in this castle, in Dunsinane Castle, in the throne room. It's completely bare. I think that what he's saying with the set design is what it means to be king has nothing to do with all of everything, all the ceremony, the trappings of ceremony. Exactly. It's all about the man sitting there on the throne, and that is why it's so completely empty and so completely bare. Is because arguably, Macbeth is the wrong person. He doesn't deserve the role that he assumes because of the underhand way in which he got it, and it's just left this sort of void, this moral void, if you like, when he assumes the throne. So I love all of that. I love the cinematography as well. Like you said, it's black and white. It's shot in the 4:3 aspect ratio. So I think for me, that again kind of evokes the proscenium arch of a traditional theatre shape rather than the widescreen of a typical cinema screen. For neophytes like myself, James, like I've said in the past, I learn as much about some of the technical aspects talking with you. For those listeners out there who don't know, what is a 4:3 aspect? Okay, right. Essentially, remember old movies and the shape of the screen, the shape of the film is different. It's almost a square. It's 4 long by 3 wide at that ratio. Today, we're far more used to seeing things in a far more wide screen, sort of epic scope that can go as wide as 240 to 1. Now that is, and then that's how you would have watched stuff on TV for many, many years. And it was all to do with the old cameras that they were using, which were far more based on traditional still cameras and all the rest of it. And it wasn't until they were looking for ways to make the cinema experience more exciting in like the 50s and 60s when TV started coming in much the same way that we got 3D and IMAX and all the rest of it. Now, there's always been this ongoing battle about how can we sex up the cinema to keep people coming when they don't even have to leave their homes anymore. And so that's when you started getting these sort of epic scope movies like the big sword and sandal epics, and then things like Lawrence of Arabia, the big westerns, which were using these anamorphic widescreen lenses. To really sort of make the most of that width. Ironically, what IMAX is doing now is going the other way again. It's going, we're going to go as wide as that, and we're going to go up again. And which is weird because you're almost going back to the same 4:3 shape, although it's anamorphic as well. So it's the maximum both. Suffice to say that 4:3 is sort of old school, right? Back how it was in the 30s, up until let's say the 50s. I think it's the 50s is when you started getting CinemaScope. And, remember CinemaScope, and the other great thing was the different kinds of color, Technicolor and Eastman color, and all of those. So 4:3 is that sort of squarer, more old-fashioned kind of framing, and I think the reason why they have chosen to do that is, firstly, that it does sort of remind you of the theatrical stage, that what's called the proscenium arch, which is right. I'm familiar with that. Yep. Yeah, and also it looks like an old movie. And I think that a lot of the stylistic choices in terms of the lighting and the use of monochrome really evoke those old European films
Putting my pretentious hat on, my film school hat on a little bit here.
Here he goes, everybody.
Those old European masters like Fritz Lang, the German expressionists, but most, for me, it most closely evokes a guy called Carl Theodor Dreyer, who was a Danish filmmaker in kind of the 30s. And his most famous film is a film called The Passion of Joan of Arc, which is arguably the most famous version of the Joan of Arc story. And there it really focuses on the trial. And it again uses these very sparse, very bare kind of sets. It feels very theatrical. It uses a lot of these tight close-ups on these incredibly sort of expressive performances. And for me, watching this version of Macbeth, it really triggered and really resembled a lot of images from that film, and I think it's no coincidence. I think it's very deliberate, and it's just an evocation, particularly being made by Americans. I think it's this evocation of that sort of European aesthetic, which has as much to do with sort of folklore and paganism as it has to do with religion. I think particularly the way that the witches are represented in the film. You know, this is not so much a story about, well, look, it's okay. Let me rephrase that. So many kings were decided back then there was the divine right of kings, right? The kings were, the royal families and the kings were chosen by God. Mm-hmm. And the great sort of...
I'm deferring to the English knowledge on this. The Yankee here, we're going to...
The whole point of Macbeth is that he interrupts that lineage.
He does,
and he's told by witches in the forest. You can't get more pagan than that.
Yes,
it's like you can be king if you want to be king. You will be king, but you've got to go out there and kill everybody in your way in order to get that.
Right.
And so it's and I for me that's a very kind of sort of European mood. Yeah. There's this sort of mythological, folkloric kind of thing, and I think that the use of this cinematography, the use of this frame, this evocation of these old European masters, and a lot of their work has this very kind of slightly sort of spooky, surreal.
The witches were done really well because even though we'd use the term witches, when you say the term pagan, the way this film is shot, there is a natural pagan outdoor feel. They obviously they transform into ravens, and like you said, that is, obviously you're dealing with a Christian nation, so that would represent order, the natural line of kings, the natural line of succession, like you said. Then he basically is willing to invoke this outside pagan perspective into this, and it introduces chaos, because not only is there murder involved, but almost like I'm thinking of John Borman's Excalibur. That when the natural order is disrupted, it affects even nature itself. Nature itself is affected. Something is off in the universe, and that's what is really captured well in this film, is that once the murder occurs and he succumbs to the temptation of the witches and to Lady Macbeth of just snatch it for yourself, just take what is not rightfully yours, because it can be yours,
because it's within your grasp.
It's within your grasp, but that has a way of affecting everything. And it had me thinking about Borman's Excalibur, about how order has to be reestablished in the end. And ultimately, that's what happens in Macbeth. Order finds itself again. The natural line of succession resumes, and Macbeth is simply forgotten and cast aside.
Yeah, for sure. And if you look at it from a historical point of when Shakespeare wrote this, is that's equally interesting as well, because it's one of his later plays. He wrote in the sort of 1604, 5, something like that. So Queen Elizabeth I had died, and James I had taken over, who was also James VI of Scotland.
Scotland, yes.
Yeah, and it was that transition from the Tudors to the Stuarts. And James I was the primary benefactor for the Globe Theatre and for William Shakespeare's company and all the rest of it. And so this was very much Shakespeare kind of going, oh, my king, here's this, I'm going to tell you this wonderful story. Because I think James I, whether or not it's 100% true or not, I'm not entirely sure. But James I believed that he was descended from Banquo. And so Banquo is Macbeth's friend, who is with him when they meet the witches.
Right.
Who is told, you won't be king, but you will sire, generations of kings in the future to come. So ultimately, Macbeth is the story of the king who almost cheated James I out of his chance to be king, and so so that's why it's such a sort of triumphant victory at the end, because although Banquo himself is murdered, his children, his lineage survives to take their rightful place on the Scottish throne, and eventually the English throne in the years to come. So it's very much Shakespeare kind of paying homage to his new benefactor in that regard, and I thought that's kind of fun.
Yes. Well, let's talk about the cast. What do you think about the casting of Macbeth?
Well, I mean, obviously it's somewhat brave, and diverse and all the rest of it. Casting Denzel Washington as
but he's not unfamiliar to Shakespeare.
No, not at all. Not at all. But, if you're going against tradition, you're casting an African-American man as a Scottish king in whatever century it's supposed to be. I mean, this is hardly mold breaking these days, but I think it's still worth noting.
Well, it's interesting you say that because of things like Hamilton, increased diversity, we don't really bat an eye about that anymore. But I remember watching Shakespeare in the 90s. I remember watching Denzel in Much Ado About Nothing, where he played Don Pedro, and Keanu Reeves is his brother. And I remember thinking, well, how does that work? Like, did they have I'm trying to logically put this together. And then I remember we saw Much Ado About Nothing as a stage play in 97, Tammy and I. And it was a multi-ethnic cast, and that was so. Not that I was against it in any negative aspect, but my logical mind was thinking, well, how does that work? Not realizing we're going to enter into a time where, like with Hamilton, we're going to cast characters in multiple ethnicities. And it doesn't really matter because the story is what matters. The story is what we're trying to focus in on. But that's just a side note of how perspectives have changed, even with myself in 20, 25 years. Whereas, like I said before, it was confusing to me. To me, it'd be like having doing The Last Emperor, Pu Yi, and having a Caucasian guy as the Chinese emperor. It'd be like
that's the one direction you're not allowed to do it in. I think.
No, you can't go that way.
Can't stick with the white guys. They're sick of us.
No. Yeah, that's definitely.
You can mix it up pretty much any other way. It's one of these things, and I think it's something they've been doing in theatre far longer, and it's something that is creeping into cinema a lot more and becoming far more, it's just par for the course and acceptable. And it is absolutely fine. I think you have to just kind of let go of whether it makes sort of logical sense in as much as ethnicities through the generations of a particular family. It's just like, let's get the best person for the role.
When you think of things like Shakespeare, because of the settings that they're situated in, naturally they would only be, by and large, Caucasian actors, which is really not allowing for the diversity of talent that we have today. So,
and of course, back in the early 17th century, when this was first performed, you would have probably men playing all the female parts still as well. So Lady Macbeth was probably even being played by a boy, back then. And so, we've come a long way.
Yes. Rightfully so too. Rightfully so. But back to Denzel.
Yeah, I mean, I thought Denzel was fantastic.
Yeah,
I really did.
He brings that gravitas that we always talks about. He's gravitas.
He's such a heavyweight. He's so great as an actor, and has a long history of stage work as well. He came up through theatre. He has great stories that he would tell. I've seen him tell on late night talk shows about working with Morgan Freeman, in stage productions or the rest of it, and Freeman really sort of putting him in his place when he was just this cocky young actor and what have you. But he is fantastic. And I thought what he brought to the character was a clarity, an understanding, a confidence and a clarity of the language, which can be difficult to really get that meaning across. It's one thing, you've got these very poetic, long, descriptive soliloquies all the way through Shakespeare, which uses a lot of sort of iambic pentameter and a lot of very dense, very vivid imagery. It can be really tricky, getting the point across in a performance of what you're actually talking about. And some people lean into it one way where they're like, let's just go as big and flowery as I can with the imagery as if I'm just reciting poetry, and let's hope that people know the story and know what I'm talking about. What I felt in Denzel's performance was a real vivid understanding of what is actually happening and what the words mean in terms of the story that I don't remember seeing in all that recently. It felt so accessible. And I've studied Shakespeare. I studied it at school, and I was in them at school, and I even taught a bit of Shakespeare a while ago, including Macbeth. But this was great. This made it feel so accessible that I think anybody, even unfamiliar with the text or with that kind of language, could watch his performance in particular. I think everybody in the film is pretty good, but his performance in particular, and really understand everything that's being said and really follow his train of thought.
Yeah. Now, Denzel, some of the internal dialogues that he would have with himself in this movie, it really conveyed that the paranoia, the ambition, what goes on in a person's head when he lets chaos in. And to me, this was just visually stunning to watch. Frances McDormand playing the Lady Macbeth character, just needling him and feeding him and prodding him on. She's won everything there is to win. When you bring her into the film, it just, the two of them together were a spectacle to watch. I love Shakespeare. I love good Shakespeare. I love when it's done well. And this was just stunning to watch. And the supporting cast as well. You had Brendan Gleeson I like to joke, about like Judi Dench a couple of weeks ago. Judi Dench makes everything better in Belfast. Brendan Gleeson makes everything better in this movie. He brings that added gravitas to the film when Denzel kills him, it is such a scene of, I trusted you. I'm in your home. You're going to murder me in your own home? What level of perversion and decrepit behavior have you descended to that you would do this? The looks in his eyes, and Denzel telling him shh, and this, like, it's all going to be over soon. And it was a powerful scene to watch between the two of them.
Oh, for sure. And that's a role that you have to cast so well, because he's not in it for very long. He only has a couple of scenes, King Duncan, but in those scenes and in that brief amount of screen time, you have to convey this is what a king should be.
Yeah.
He's kind, he's benevolent, but he's magisterial. He's like a kind of lion, really.
Yes,
he's just there, and he's proud, and he's respected and respectful and gracious, but confident in his leadership and all the rest of it. He is a proper benevolent leader.
Yeah.
And that's what makes Macbeth's decision all the more awful, with this betrayal of trust. Like you said, he invites him into his own home and then kills him in the guest room.
Like there's no worse regicide than come into my house, into my hospitality, and
you are my guest of honor, and I'm going to slit your throat. Yes. It's absolutely awful. And the fact that it's his wife who needles him to do it. She's like, come on, what kind of man are you? And it really plays into like the weakest elements of, male insecurities and what have you. That his wife is just there going, come on. Have you got ambition or not? This is your perfect opportunity. What kind of man are you? Step up. And it's such a perverted manipulation of what it means to be a man.
And this is why Shakespeare survives in such popularity 500, 600, 700 years later. These are still...
Well, not quite, about 400, but yeah.
400, 1600, yeah. 16, 7. late 1500s, wasn't late 1500s?
He started in late 1500s into the early 1600s. I think this one was written in the very early 1600s.
Okay.
So what's that? 400 years ago?
Yeah. Plus
420. All right.
Anyhow, these
we'll pick
themes,
a number. We'll pick a number and edit around it.
These themes, like you were saying, these are with us today. I mean, we see this played out in politics all the time. You know, Hillary Clinton. I don't mean to be this as a political podcast, but Hillary Clinton, by her naysayers, are always being compared to Lady Macbeth. And whether you embrace that representation, that Lady Macbeth motif is with us with leaders in the world stage. And that's why these kind of stories still resonate with us, because this, like you said, the appeal to the male insecurities, this the insecure person who tends to be authoritarian, as opposed to the Duncan who is magnanimous and is secure in his leadership and who he is. The juxtaposition between those two characters, I see it in American politics. I see it in European politics. This is something that is relevant today as it was 420 years ago.
No, absolutely. And it's a theme that Shakespeare comes back to over and over and over again. I mean, look at Hamlet. That's an incredible abuse of power.
Yeah.
The king's brother murders him and assumes the throne, and his wife, and it falls to the young prince to step up, and he has a massive crisis over that. Othello, he's a powerful guy in a great position of control, but then he just gets this sort of earworm in his head from his quote unquote friend that, I think your wife's been cheating on you. And that completely
Othello is the one, I think Lawrence Fishburne was in the one a few years ago.
With Kenneth Branagh as Iago, I think.
That's right. That's right. Othello is one that always frustrates me, because I'm always like, just believe your wife. Why are you believing everybody else? I find that play very frustrating. But we could go into a long exposition on other Shakespeare. I love talking Shakespeare. Did I ever tell you I ran the Hong Kong Shakespeare discussion group back in the late 90s?
You did not.
In Lang Kwai Fong. South China Morning Post covered us. We were kind of a thing for a couple of years.
Oh, fantastic! No, I had no idea. Before my time,
we met every Thursday night. I had to study for my English Lit major. I had to study some Shakespeare, and I thought, I'd like to study with other people. So, long story short, I put an ad out in the old pub rag, the Hong Kong magazine, and just anybody want to talk Shakespeare. It's going to be here in Lang Kwai Fong. And we had like a dozen people show up.
That's fantastic.
And it grew to about 15 regulars. And anyhow.
Well, you did a different play every meeting.
We would actually, I remember on the first night we voted, so when shall we meet again? Everybody's like, can we do this again next Thursday? It's in Lang Kwai Fong. We're all going to be here anyhow. Let's just have an hour and a half discussion and then go out and get drinks. Of course, we had drinks over during our discussion as well.
Of course.
And but what we would do is we would usually spend about 2 to 3 weeks on a particular play to really unpack it. And then we'd say, let's move on to another play. And we'd all kind of vote, what do we want to do? Oh, we did a comedy last time. Let's do a tragedy or, historical or whatever.
That's brilliant.
It was a lot of fun. I still keep in touch with 2 or 3 of that group.
Oh, nice. Yeah, no, I remember when I first came to Hong Kong and I was teaching in international secondary school here. We had a bit of like free time in the curriculum, a little bit of breathing space in there. So I thought, well, look, I don't think they're too young. I think this is a great way to sort of hold their hand and introduce them to a bit of Shakespeare as well. Yeah. So, and it's teenagers. So you do Romeo and Juliet because it's gang warfare, it's young love, it's defying your parents, it's all the great stuff that they enjoy. And it went over so well that I thought, let's do another one. And so we did Macbeth because at the time it was one that I had never studied myself, but I really wanted to, I'd always wanted to. And so it was a fantastic opportunity for me as much as for them to like really get stuck into it, to unpack it, to just, pull out speeches, entire monologues and just work over them as if they're just a piece of poetry or whatever. Yeah. And then, detail them and just make it all accessible for them. And for me, that is just the key, is that it's so rich. There's so much in there, but so many people are just afraid of it because they're like, I don't get it. I don't understand it. It's old flowery language. I'm done. Yeah. And it's like, you have no idea what these stories are about. These are the best dramatic plots out there. And you know so many of them already.
And the language, if you can just watch it for a little while and try to absorb it, it's funny how the mind switches. We joke about this years ago in the discussion group. People who struggled with Shakespeare, who really wanted to appreciate Shakespeare and just couldn't get it. And this is for the listener out there. If you struggle with Shakespeare, if you can just pay attention, it will subtly begin to shift in your mind. You will begin to pick up things. And it doesn't hurt to know the story in advance. I always recommend when it comes to Shakespeare, just know the whole story, know the spoilers, know what's going to happen, because then you're free to just listen to the language. And I still, there's things that I've heard, a dozen times, and then suddenly I hear it and I think, oh my God, that's what he's saying. That's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. And that's why I think Shakespeare is so endearing to so many people, because I love it. And it is continually feeds the soul.
Absolutely. And it was so much of it works on so many levels, because, so many of those speeches and those conversations will, work literally on the surface of what they are. Then they've got beautiful poetic imagery in there as well. But often they've got a lot of sort of historical, like, pop culture references and that kind of stuff in there as well. There are gags at the expense of whoever might be, in power at the time. Yeah. Or some big thing that was in the news the year or so before, because it was very much theatre for the people. Yes. This wasn't for the aristocracy, if you like. It was for the masses, and so it really had to work on sort of those levels as well. And there's a lot of dirty humor in it. Yeah. And if you can't, there's a lot of action. It's bawdy as hell. Yeah, and there's a lot of knob jokes and things like that in Shakespeare. If it sounds rude, it is rude. Yeah. Do not assume, it's Shakespeare, he must mean something else. No. It's probably a knob joke.
That's what he meant. That's it. He meant the female part or something,
Yeah. Well, yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Let's bring this back in, James. Any thoughts before we go to a score? Any final thoughts on director? I do want to say this is interesting that Joel made this without Ethan, and apparently the word is Ethan Coen is kind of bored with making movies. He's giving movies a bit of a rest. He's doing other things. Joel wanted to do this, and so much the better, because we've got this amazing movie.
Yeah, no, it is interesting that after so many years, 18 films together, they suddenly decide not to. And you have noticed over the years that Ethan has kind of every now and again gone off and done something else. I remember getting a book of short stories that he had written a while ago, which are fantastic. However, this project, though, because obviously Joel Coen and Frances McDormand are a couple and have been for a long, long time, and so it feels like that it's that more of a kind of personal project, but the two of them are collaborating on almost rather than Ethan Coen. But that's fascinating. I mean, I haven't really seen a definitive answer on why they're not working together. But if Ethan's sort of stepping away, then that will be interesting for the future, to see what's happening. I
think that was the word from their longtime collaborator who produces with them, I believe, was just saying that one, the two brothers have a ton of unworked on script possibilities that they'll never get around to. And the other was that Ethan will probably do something with his brother again. It's nothing personal. It's just more of there's other things he wants to do, and he's been a little tired of filmmaking lately. And you can kind of understand it if you're a creative type, as these two are. You've kind of done your filmmaking thing. So if I'm writing short stories, or maybe he wants to do other art or some other expression, because you get to a certain age, you start to think, okay, I've got X amount of years left. What am I going to do with it? And, we all answer that question in a different way.
Yeah, it's a big ask to keep working with a sibling. I mean, I've got two sisters, and I'm not sure we would survive doing anything together, let alone like a career that's spanned like 30 odd years or whatever. One thing I did notice, and I I haven't had time to like fully dig into it. I noticed that a review popped up for the Tragedy of Macbeth yesterday or the day before, written by Ethan Coen, and I hadn't quite, and I think it's legit. I mean, it's a joke review,
right?
But I think he wrote it, and he writes and says it's Joel Coen's worst film, and it's terrible, and the reason is because it's missing a special something that all the other 18 films had. but I think he did write it, but he wrote it as a joke.
Right.
I might be completely wrong. It might be a complete lampoon.
Yeah.
And I didn't spend enough time looking into it. But my supposition is that he did do it, and it is and it is kind of a funny joke review at the expense of his brother. Yeah. So if I can find it, we could get a link and I'll put it down in the comments or something. Yeah. But all right, final thoughts about the Tragedy of Macbeth.
And what are we going to score this out of?
Ooh,
daggers.
Are these daggers I see before me? Yeah, sure. Why not? Why not? Go. Why don't you go with your final thoughts first of all?
Yeah, I think I've pretty much said everything I needed to say, other than the supporting cast was fantastic as well. Yeah. There's a number of actors. This was filmed well. Cinematography was brilliant. The casting was spot on. I really have nothing more to say other than to give this 4 daggers out of 5. I thought this was a strong film. Go see it. It's a fantastic film if you haven't already seen it.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, I agree. The supporting cast is fantastic. I mean, Catherine Hunter, who plays all 3 of the witches, and she is this fantastic contortionist. Her performance is incredible physically as well as
I was wondering how that was done. That was a visually stunning moment with the but it added to that. I don't want to, but you brought up that term. It really highlighted that pagan aspect that you mentioned earlier. The contortion. It was so chaotic and unnatural. That's what it was. It was so unnatural.
It was unhuman.
Yes, it was. But I wanted to watch it again.
Oh, sure. I mean, her movements are like the woman in The Ring, who climbs out of the TV, and there's something just unnatural, unhuman about disjointed. The way that she's
disjointed. Yeah,
and it's deeply unsettling, and it really sort of pulls you into the fact that we're not in a real world that we recognize.
Yeah.
I thought she was great, and I also actually thought, Corey Hawkins was really good as Macduff.
Macduff, yeah. I
always feel a bit sort of disappointed about the character of Macduff, or for the character of Macduff, because he's, he kind of emerges as the hero at the end, but he doesn't really have much to do ahead of that. It's not as meaty a role as it should be, I feel, and he just literally kind of wanders in at the end and, kills Macbeth.
Because his wife and kids were killed. So the backstory.
Yeah. So he's got this personal revenge. Yeah. And then I think the other guy who's worth giving a shout out to is Alex Hassel, who plays Ross. That's a character I'd never really sort of noticed as being a pivotal element, but he's really strong. It's one of the key sort of supporting characters here. And I was particularly happy to see him doing a good job, because he had popped up just a month or two earlier in Netflix's live action adaptation of Cowboy Bebop, which is this sort of very much beloved anime series, and is terrible. The show is awful, and he plays the main. I
remember your negative review of that.
Yeah, it's so bad. He plays the main villain Vicious in it, and is really bad. I don't think it's entirely his fault, but it's a really awful performance of a really awful character and a really awful adaptation. So it was so nice to see him
redeem himself
so soon after that. Yeah, redeem himself, because look, it's not my fault, and you're like, okay, great. Very happy to see that.
I thought his features were striking. I thought when he was on screen and he would interact, when he found Fleance in the field, I just found his features were very striking.
Yeah, no, he's an incredibly sort of memorable part of the film, and I wanted to give him props for. No, I love this film. I managed to see it just before the end of last year, so it made it into my top 10 of 2021. I love it for all the reasons that you've said. I mean, The cast is uniformly great. It looks fantastic. It was just the unsettling, foreboding atmosphere of it all, I think, is perfectly pitched. So I want to give it a full 5 daggers out of 5.
Wow, fantastic. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't argue with that. So we give it an aggregate score of 4.5.
Which is pretty healthy.
Pretty healthy score. All right, till next week, James.
Take it easy. Goodbye.
All right, cheers.